The Alliance for Gun Responsibility tried in the early months of its existence to push our state legislature, which at the time was Democratic, to enact a very basic common sense gun law, which was to require background checks for purchases of any firearm, universal background checks. And we figured this is a common sense law supported by huge majorities of the public, and we have a Democratic legislature. This should be a slam dunk. It wasn't. And the reason why it wasn't, the reason why this piece of legislation failed in the legislature was that the gun lobby, the National Rifle Association, controlled just enough of these Democrats, rural Democrats, to cow them into inaction. Okay? This bill didn't even get out of committee. It didn't even get a vote on the floor of the state Senate. And that was a great lesson for us. That made us realize, number one, that we had to change the game. That the NRA had dominated the game by making it a game that you might think of as an inside game, right? One in which they really didn't have to worry about the broader public. They just had to worry about, within a caucus of 49 or 50 Democratic state senators, could they peel off 3 or 4? Could they make enough noise in enough rural and exurban districts to scare 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these Democrats out of doing anything? And they could. And they played that inside game masterfully. We realized in our state that if we were going to win, it was going to take actually not just trying to play that game and beat them at that game, but actually a changing of the game altogether. Now, fortunately, we live in a state where we have measures of direct democracy. And so we said, we're going to actually turn this into an outside game. And we took all of that energy that we put into trying to pass this law within the legislature, and we said, okay, we're going to do this the hard way. And we collected 250,000 signatures across our state, put a measure on the ballot to do exactly the same thing. And later that fall, Washington State became the first state in the union to enact, by vote of the people, universal background checks for gun purchases. Right? So we changed the game from an inside game to an outside game. But we also, in the course of doing that, changed the story. Because up till then, for so long, the story of action on these issues had been a story defined by the term gun control. You'll notice I have not used that term. I hate that term. Because that term itself is one that must have been dreamed up by the gun lobby, right? Because in American civic life, a political tradition born literally of flags flying that said, "Don't tread on me," in our revolution, right? The idea of being controlled, the idea of being told by anybody, the idea that your individual liberty would be controlled by anybody is anathema. Right? And so with something like gun rights, which are baked into the Constitution, control is about the worst possible framing and story that you might want to use. But what we said was, you know what? We're not about gun control. We are about gun responsibility. We recognize that the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution today does enshrine certain rights when it comes to bearing arms. We recognize as well that with every right, for anybody older than a toddler, with every right comes a set of responsibilities. That only toddlers demand rights without responsibilities. That as grown-ups, and particularly grown-ups with something as potentially malicious and dangerous as firearms, that if you're going to cherish that right, as many people do, then you've got to cherish a set of responsibilities that are social responsibilities, that are about common sense safety. And that framing, that narrative of gun responsibility was hugely appealing. It allowed us to win this ballot measure with over 60% of the vote across the state. It allowed us to win not just die-hard anti-gun activists, but also gun owners, members of the NRA, also law enforcement leaders, people who were involved in all kinds of issues who were part of what you might think of as gun culture, who said, you bet I believe in gun responsibility. I've had firearms all my life. I teach my kids how to handle these firearms safely. We store these firearms safely. And this is a matter of common sense responsibility, adult responsibility. That's what it means to change the story.